Honorable Justice Sri Krishna, Madam Professor Vispi Balapuria, other office bearers of the Asiatic Society, ladies and gentlemen, let me at the outset thank you all for this opportunity to speak to you on a topic of what I think is considerable contemporary importance. Late Shri B.G. Deshmukh was 32 years my senior in the IAS. In Maharashtra, he was, as Madam recounted, Commissioner Brihan Mumbai Corporation, Secretary to the Chief Minister of Maharashtra, subsequently Chief Secretary of the State of Maharashtra. In Government of India, he was Secretary in the Ministry of Labour. He was Cabinet Secretary and he was Principal Secretary to 3 Prime Ministers of India, Shriyuts Rajiv Gandhi, V.P. Singh and Mr. Chandrasekhar. Those of us who are familiar with the civil service will immediately recognize that there is absolutely no civil service post of importance that Shri B.G. Deshmukh did not hold. Nevertheless, I am told, I didn't know him personally, I am told he wore all this very lightly and continued to be a very simple, approachable person through his life. It's therefore truly an honor to be here at the invitation of the Asiatic Society to deliver an endowment lecture in his name. When you talk to people in Maharashtra and Delhi about him, sort of the first things that come to mind, and it's directly related to the topic that I'm going to talk about, regulation, is the word fairness. Across the board, people I spoke to, and I spoke to a lot of his contemporaries, the first things they said about him was that Mr. Deshmukh was a very fair man. And some of it will get reflected in the quotations that I have from his writings on regulation. So it's even more appropriate that I get to speak on regulation, fairness, and rule of law as measures to improve good governance in India. We are all used to the word regulation, in fact, to the point where regulators in India are now accepted as an everyday reality. In my talk today, what I will try to do is to obtain greater clarity on what regulation precisely means, how it is done. I will show some clear strengths of regulation and weaknesses of the Indian regulatory system and try and suggest what I think are paths for further progress on this. I will use examples primarily from the financial sector. Financial regulation is perhaps the most mature piece of the Indian regulatory state. It is certainly the most studied when compared with other sectors, and it is perhaps the most relevant to an audience in Mumbai. It also happens to be the sector that I know the most. But the difficulties that I will be describing in the financial sector regulation are actually present across the entire Indian regulatory state to a higher or a lesser degree. So the idea is not actually to single out financial sector regulators for criticism. As you will see, when we employ these sort of standard toolkits and theories of regulation and go below the surface and obtain explanations that are based on incentives and design of organizations, we will see that these ideas cut across sectors. Before I plunge into the full lecture, let me try and summarize the main idea in 4 or 5 buckets. Essentially, I wish to say the following 4 things to the august audience here today. Number 1, a considerable enterprise of the Indian state has arisen that is termed now in a lot of literature across the world as the regulatory state. Regulation impacts our present day lives much more than we actually realize. In many ways, regulation has yielded very good outcomes for consumers and society at large. And most regulatory authorities have been successful in maintaining a certain level of safety and quality in the goods and services that are delivered by regulated entities. The second point is, this, however, has not been an unmixed blessing. Alongside these triumphs, there are many problems that have arisen. Broadly, I would put them under 4 categories. Category 1 would be problems relating to rule of law. Problem 2 would relate to competition. Problem 3 would relate to consumer protection. And problem 4 would relate to economic dynamism. So it's my sense that the initial optimism about setting up specialized regulators is giving way to expression of greater concerns about the working of at least some of these regulators. Point 3, a body of knowledge broadly called regulatory theory has emerged elsewhere and in India, which essentially harnesses knowledge from political science, Constitution of India, public administration, and economics. And these sort of come together in regulatory theory so that we can understand the sources of organizational capacity in regulators or lack thereof, the actual ground performance of regulators is the consequences of design decisions on powers, structure, decision-making mechanisms, and most importantly, accountability mechanisms of regulators. The concluding point that I'll make as part of this lecture is that there is considerable optimism among thinkers on regulation in India on the extent to which we can navigate towards solutions for all these concerns that I mentioned that further good governance and regulation and overall will improve the situation. And I use the term good here to stand for 2 things: good for economic development and good for citizen well-being. In the remainder of the lecture, I will try to, together with you, explore these essentially 4 lines of inquiry. Let me start with the idea of regulation, and more precisely, the idea of what I call statutory regulatory authorities. On an average day, if we take most of our lives, our daily routines intersect with regulation at countless points and moments. The apps that a lot of us would have used to book a cab to reach this Darbar Hall and to make payment for the ride, the 5G technology that powers these apps, the medications that many of us take, the things that we ingest which claim to be organic food or which claim to be dietary supplements, financial instruments like securities, mutual funds, insurance, pensions, services like electricity, water, and petroleum, all these, and these are only a few examples, all these are regulated commodities and regulated services. The quality of these goods and services, their quantity, the number of service providers who are allowed to offer these services, and sometimes even their prices are shaped effectively by the Indian state. Going beyond this, as further examples of regulation, the professionals that we regularly consult and trust, for example, our general physician, the dentist, the pharmacist, are all regulated by their respective professional regulatory councils. In the 21st century, in short, regulation is everywhere, and the authorities entrusted with it impinge upon the working of the market economy, besides impinging on the well-being of citizens in numerous and important ways. How much do we know as individuals about the purity and safety of the ingredients that are used to make the medicines that we sort of pop regularly in, or about the safekeeping of the money that we hand over to a mutual fund for investment or an insurance company for covering a contingency that may occur decades from now? Do we really know whether the organic vegetable that we paid more for because it's organic is in fact organic? In the jargon of economics, there is what is called a market failure of asymmetric information in all the examples that I just now outlined. The provider of these goods and services inherently have more information about the products and services that they offer than you and I have as consumers. Regulation is introduced to combat this information asymmetry, to solve this information asymmetry. It would be clearly unreasonable to ask an individual to buy a strip of paracetamol, pick one of the 10 tablets at random, give them to a private lab for purity testing. It simply will not work. Likewise, it would be very unreasonable to ask grandmothers and dentists to know the safety and soundness of a bank. The use of the coercive power of the state to address these problems is the subject of regulation. We are more confident of buying the things that I mentioned when a regulator has helped reduce the information asymmetry problem. Done well, regulation is about addressing market failure, particularly reducing asymmetric information. Beyond that, there is also an important role for regulation in improving competition in markets and reducing what in economic jargon is called negative externalities, the spillover effects of a good beyond the person consuming, but that are negative in sort of nature. The use of the power of the state to address these problems, as I said, is what we look at when we look at regulation. And regulation on balance has done very well. I mentioned this early on. As an example, let's look at our stock market. India today has the 4th largest stock market in the world. This market has developed well in the last 30 plus years after regulation in this sector began under the watchful eyes of a newly created regulator of the early 90s called the Securities and Exchange Board of India, the SEBI. Likewise, in sectors like telecom, electricity, our tariffs are perhaps among the lowest in the world. At this point, I want to introduce the sort of distinction between regulation and the word regulator. Any action by the state, by the government, which forces or sort of enjoins private firms to behave in different ways in order to address the 3 categories of problems that I mentioned earlier as market failures, can be termed regulation. This kind of an action can be located inside a government department. For example, the regulator for pharmaceuticals in India, the regulator who regulates medicines and medicinal preparations in India, it's an agency which goes by the name of the Central Drugs Standards Control Organization, CDSCO, is actually a unit which is housed inside the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare of the Government of India. So it's within the department of a government unit. On the other hand, the regulator could be a separate, distinct legal entity. For example, a body with its own governing board, with its own staff, and executive management created by a legislation. This is what I term a statutory regulatory authority, or an SRA, or a regulator for short. And there are many that lie in between these two extremes of a department inside, or a unit inside a government department, and a complete standalone entity created by a law, which is a separate legal person in its own right. The regulatory authority that we will be focusing on today is the latter one, the one that is set up by a law with its own powers and functions specified in the law that creates it. Let's take the example that I started with, the SEBI, the Securities Exchange Board of India. SEBI has many mandates. One of these is the mandate to regulate what the financial sector would call the assets management or fund management activity. In plain English, entities like mutual funds to which we hand over our own money for management and giving us a return. As we have seen earlier, this activity is necessarily characterized by information asymmetry, and hence the conduct and the working of the mutual fund needs to be regulated. An entity which wants to be an MF, therefore, needs a license from the regulator. But finally, this MF is a body of human beings. The person who actually handles your money should, just plain common sense, be both competent and be a person of integrity, be honest. What is competence? What is honesty? Someone has to define these terms. And what constituted competence to handle funds, say 25 years ago in 1994 or 95, may not be competence in the much more complex market of today. The 3+ decades post-liberalization bears testimony to this evolving regulatory landscape of India. Today, there are over 20, in fact, I think the current number is probably 24, statutory regulatory authorities just at the union level, at the Government of India level, spanning sectors such as banking, securities and capital markets, telecommunications, electricity, water, food safety, competition, warehousing, airports, major ports, insolvency and bankruptcy, pensions, insurance, medical professionals, dentists, nurses, auditors, valuers. I have not even begun counting agencies that have been set up at the level of the state. Now, I'll spare you the details of this list, but the idea is to sort of recognize this large, extensive enterprise called the regulatory state. But getting back to the same example that I started with, the mutual fund, and to continue with the examples of competence and integrity, we also would not like, say, very complicated products of this industry to be sold to people who are not capable of understanding the complexity. Now, someone has to now define what is appropriate and appropriate for what kind of customers. Now, at another level, all these are restrictions on the business of a mutual fund, and in the Indian constitutional system, these restrictions can be imposed on a business only by the force of law. The Indian constitutional system requires a law to be able to impose these restrictions. Now, can you imagine a parliamentary law which actually elaborates on all these? I have dealt with one small aspect of one of the numerous products of one regulated entity of one regulator. Imagine the millions of such things which the law will need to deal with, and not merely deal with, but actually elaborate. It would also be apparent that these are not going to be static. These are inherently fluid and dynamic, and these will keep changing and often change very rapidly. If these are codified in parliamentary law, each change in this law would require a parliamentary amendment. Clearly, we all recognize that this is impossible. So what did the parliament do? The parliament created a very skeletal legislative framework. In this case, it's called the SEBI Act, the Act of 1992 originally. And this act says that the SEBI, the Securities and Exchange Board of India, will make regulations to regulate all these aspects, and these regulations will have the force of law. And these regulations will have the force of binding law. These are rules of binding conduct. However, it's clear, or it should be clear, that it's not enough to just prescribe these requirements. These will need to be implemented, and they will need to be brought about in practice. So the same law, the SEBI Act, goes on to say that the organization SEBI will enforce and implement the regulations that it makes. And in the case of SEBI, when SEBI finds transgressions from these regulations, it also proceeds to penalize the violators. My former colleague in the Ministry of Finance, a gentleman called Dr. M.S. Sahu, who subsequently served in the SEBI and was also chairman of the Insolvency Bankruptcy Board of India, was the first to raise the alarm in a 2012 piece when he pointed out, very explicitly pointed out, a lot of us had realized it, but Dr. Sahu pointed out that in these regulators in India, we have often fused all the three branches of the state: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. These agencies or authorities issue regulations on the functioning of the market which have the force of law. They license the players in the market. They conduct inspections, they conduct investigations on licensed players, and they also impose penalties on them if they are found to be in contravention of these regulations. Now, you will surely agree, this is a massive accumulation of powers in one agency and clearly necessitates careful oversight, careful accountability mechanisms, and adherence to principles of fairness and due process. I will presently come back to this issue soon, but given the sort of nature of this domain, whether it's finance or pharma or food safety, The other thing we will immediately recognize is that we would like these decisions to be taken at a distance from politics and ideally entirely on the basis of technical domain considerations. This consideration therefore calls for an arm's length agency distant from government and staffed essentially by subject matter experts. And this kind of expertise is typically unlikely to be available in traditional government departments. These authorities, therefore, need to be able to hire employees who are very different from the conventional civil service type recruits. The compensation and the terms of service for these employees would also need to be very different from government departments. Perhaps they need to be much more in tune with employees of the regulated domain. Ideally, therefore, we would want SEBI employees to look less like employees of the Ministry of Finance and much more like employees of an exchange or a depository or an investment bank. To summarize this part of the sort of idea, India today has a large number of statutory regulatory authorities which are empowered bodies. I took one example, but the multitude of regulators that we have are empowered differently, different degrees of empowerment, but all created because the activities that they regulate, the activities that they deal with, need arm's length, apolitical decision making. They require subject matter expertise and very often the need to act with speed, which is not always easy within the governmental departmental design. Excuse me. Let me move to the second section of my lecture, the concerns. In the opening section, I alluded to the various concerns, rule of law, etc., etc. Let's start with the first of them, namely rule of law. I will discuss this in some detail with some examples, but the arguments that I will make are broadly similar in the other three sort of sections of concerns. And in the interest of time, I will not necessarily articulate all of these. In case there is interest and there are questions, I'll come back to these. To talk about rule of law, let's again go back to our friendly neighborhood regulator, the SEBI. SEBI has issued, since its inception, more than 650 regulations, including amendments. If the SEBI did not exist, the Parliament would have been expected to pass these 650 plus laws on highly technical subject matter, like mergers and acquisitions, mutual fund is an example I gave, exchanges, depositories, fairly complex areas of finance. On the other hand, notwithstanding the fact that the Parliament, quote unquote, may not have subject matter expertise, in a constitutional sense, in a political sense, it's only the Parliament which has the legitimacy in lawmaking. And the simple theory is parliamentarians have won elections, have the mandate, and therefore have the formal right to impose coercive behavior on part of the state on entities. On the other hand, officials at SEBI are not formally empowered in the same sense as parliamentarians are. But for a lot of our activity, it is these officials who have gone full steam into the business of making laws. Apart from issuing and enforcing regulations, as I mentioned earlier, and I want to emphasize this point, many regulatory authorities in India can also conduct what are called quasi-judicial proceedings, and impose penalties if entities that they regulate have not complied with the regulations that they've made. They can also decide to impose restrictions on the business activity of the entity, including taking away the license to do business. Prior to the establishment of bodies like the SEBI, ordinarily in India, it's only the judicial fora which could impose these kinds of punishments. Those of us who are familiar with political science would recall that from the 17th century onwards, there is a nice sort of building block of political science, which is the idea of separation of powers. In its essence, what separation of powers tells us is that the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches should be separate but co-equal branches of government. The Parliament, as legislature, should enact the Indian Penal Code. The executive, in this case the police, should conduct investigations and with the prosecutions wing take this forward. But by design, they should not have a say in what the law is. Judiciary is the only arm of government which, in the classic separation of powers, the agency which can award a punishment. The police or the MP who wrote the law cannot impose a punishment. Separation of powers or its obverse, checks and balances, is an important aspect of the Indian Constitution, and I'm sure all of us know this, have been held by multiple court pronouncements as part of what is called the basic structure of the Indian Constitution. As an analogy, just to dramatize the point I'm making, let me give you an example. A traffic police officer on Marine Drive decides on the spot whether 30 kilometers per hour or 20 kilometers per hour is the right speed limit for the road. That is, the officer decides the content of the law. He then decides to enforce it on a violator, and if you happen to be a violator, he has the power, let's say, to take away your license. Now that you hear it in this manner, are you still comfortable with the sweeping powers that we have given our regulators? Every element of state power axiomatically requires commensurate checks and balances. As an example, the actions of the policeman are shaped by the Criminal Procedure Code and the various police acts. Perhaps discussing this, we would argue that the way forward for the Indian police lies in codifying their activities in greater detail through such procedural law. But when we turn to regulators and their exercise of legislative, executive, and judicial powers, there is actually very negligible procedural law. Let me illustrate this lack of procedural safeguards and process justice issues with one recent example. I've written about this in one of my business standard columns, so some of you may have read it. A press release issued by the regulator who's perhaps just 300 meters away from here, the Reserve Bank of India, some months ago, directed PPBL, the Paytm Payments Bank Limited, to stop onboarding of customers with immediate effect. Existing customers were allowed to withdraw or utilize the balances in all their accounts, but were not allowed to make additional deposits or do credit transactions. PPBL was also told that no other banking services could be carried out by that entity with effect from a particular date, a prospective date, 29/2/2004. In plain English, essentially the RBI stopped the operations of PPBL. Prior to the action, just as a matter of fact, PPBL had 3 crore accounts, over 7 lakh point of sale terminals, 3.5 crore UPI QR codes that were associated with PPBL, 30 crore wallets. On the Indian roads at that point in time, there were close to 1 crore of fast tags issued by PPBL. All of them were impacted by the RBI action. Now, this is not to reproach the RBI's regulatory or supervisory actions in a substantive sense. It may well be the case that there were serious violations justifying the said action. The issue is that none of these crores of users know what actually went wrong in PPBL, and all we have is not a speaking order, not an order. We have a 1-paragraph press release on the website of the RBI. Now, commentators who study this subject have documented innumerable examples of this kind and cases. I think the basic point that I'm trying to make is we need greater adoption and visibility of rule of law process in the actions of SRAs. One more example, much more sort of tragic in its consequences. About a decade ago, poor and middle class Indians running into crores lost a little over 6 trillion rupees investing in a regulated product called the ULIP, Unit Linked Insurance Plans. The sectoral regulator, IRDA, Insurance Regulatory Development Authority, had allowed the continuation of a product that is actually a bit of an oxymoron. It was an insurance product with zero insurance. In other words, it is what you and I would call a mutual fund product. But this was a mutual fund product with none of the safeguards of a mutual fund product because it happened to be in the domain of another regulator. Now, as will happen in markets, greedy companies took advantage of this loophole, and in the watch of the IRDA, Indian consumers lost a little over 6 trillion rupees. Susan Thomas, Hosea, Monica Hallan, and Renuka Sane have documented this entire saga and the regulatory failures in a very, very well-researched paper, which brings out step by step the failure of the regulatory system. Now, going beyond finance, we are all familiar with those horrific episodes of killer cough syrups that are coming out of manufacturing facilities formally licensed by the Indian system, not only to produce, but actually export medicines. All of these factories, which are currently under some kind of action, were all formally licensed to produce and export. And we know what havoc they've caused in Africa, in parts of former Soviet Russia. Now, are such regulatory failures and overreach going unnoticed? They are not. A constitutional scholar and author, Pratik Datta, in a seminal paper in the context of RBI, his paper only talks about the RBI, says, and I quote, "A recent trend in India, which assumes significance, is what he draws our attention to." He says, "The frequency of judicial review by the courts of the Indian central bank actions appears to have substantially increased in the recent past. He has compiled data. He's examined the total number of matters disposed as well as pending, filed before the Supreme Court, only the Supreme Court, he hasn't taken the high courts, from 2000 to 2021, where the Reserve Bank of India appeared as a respondent, and shows that there is an explosive increase in judicial review against RBI, and this particularly jumps up from 2014, and the marked jump, as you can guess, is from 2017. 2017, the paper surmises, is perhaps the jump is followed by the demonetization exercise which had happened a couple of months ago. Now, people of my generation in this room have seen the 1960s, the 70s and 80s. This was the age when prosperity and success in Mumbai or Bangalore depended on flying to Delhi to get approvals and influence rules. The central planning systems that we had then induced essentially stagnation in India. The reform of the early 90s kicked off a great age of economic growth, and I think what we need now is a wave of injection of greater elements of economic freedom, but accompanied by rule of law into the areas touched by regulators, so as to change gears from private entities who primarily obey regulators to private entities who primarily look to customers and use frontiers technology in accordance with good regulation to serve customers, consumers in innovative ways while competing vigorously in the market. Quick look at what does regulatory theory say about what I described to you. Regulatory theory is fundamentally about stepping back from individual transactions, stepping back from one domain or one regulator, and asking questions about how regulators in general work and how they can be made to work better. I have categorized the four themes here as people, process, autonomy, and accountability. Let me start with people. Technical expertise and subject matter knowledge of the regulated domain is the raison d'etre of an SRA. Hence, the quality of persons who constitute the SRA and how they are appointed becomes a critical factor in their working as well as their effectiveness. Now, there are two categories of persons who constitute this entity called the Statutory Regulatory Authority. The first one is the top level, consisting of those who are full-time employees of the SRA, whether it's SEBI or RBI or Food Safety Standards Authority of India, and are also part of the top decision-making body, namely the governing board of the SRA. These, like deputy governors of RBI, whole-time members of SEBI, are appointees of the government. These are appointed by the government. The next category consists of persons below the board level, and in most SRAs, they are appointed by the SRA, by the regulator themselves, with usually minimal but different degrees of involvement of the government department. I'm summarizing practices and legislative prescriptions across 20-25 regulators, but this is the general practice. My colleague Amrita Pillai and I took one sector, the financial sector, and did a detailed analysis of the full-time senior government appointees of the SRAs in the financial sector only by looking at data in the public domain. The findings there can be summarized in one sentence, exactly one sentence, and it will not come as a surprise to people who are very familiar with this domain. The senior level people in financial sector SRAs are largely serving/former government officials. In part, this is directly because the appointment process is dominated by the executive government with very little external participation. And equally interesting, if you look at the tenures of these government appointees, they are entirely unpredictable. There are appointees who've been given a 2-year term and not extended. There are appointees who've been given 2 3-year terms. There are those who've been given a 3-year term plus 1 plus 1. There are appointees who've been given a 3-year term plus 3 or plus 2. You name the permutation combination that is possible and you will find all of those combinations. These are all appointments. I'm talking about the appointments that are made by government. So the idea of a diverse group of subject matter experts with predictable and fixed, decent long tenures to go about regulation in an essentially technical and sort of subject matter focused manner with minimal political consideration at play is some distance away. What about the operational level staff of the SRAs? These are generally, in most SRAs, they are not from the civil services, they are not government persons, but are increasingly becoming civil service-like, with many of the negative features that you would associate with the permanent civil service without much of the positives. Much like government departments, there is no serious injection of external talent in sectors which are dynamic, which are changing rapidly, and where knowledge gets outdated very quickly. And SRAs are also, I think, increasingly turning out, like government departments, to be insular and inward looking. Expertise, therefore, is an issue that needs greater attention, and expertise is the starting point for creating an SRA. Let's move to process. Power to make binding rules of conduct is effectively the power to coerce, and as I said earlier, in democratic societies, it's usually associated with elected bodies who are formally, at least in theory, formally accountable to the people. Ordinarily, therefore, one would expect elaborate safeguards on the exercise of this power, this lawmaking power, when the power is conferred on non-elected bodies like SRAs. It's a surprise that most Indian statutes that create SRAs do not write down the processes through which regulators will exercise this enormous power of writing legislation. They are also equally silent very often on the procedures for the executive and the judicial powers. How do SRAs actually do regulations? Some SRAs, in fact now I think most SRAs put out drafts of regulation for public consultation, but there is typically very little effort on the part of the society, on the part of us in responding. You speak to some of the societies, for instance, investor protection agencies and bodies which one would ordinarily expect that they would respond. Their responses very often our feedback is completely ignored. So we've stopped giving feedback. One doesn't know where is the problem, but clearly regulations thus get drafted mostly by the staff of SRAs and are typically rubber stamped by the board. And they are required by law to be placed in Parliament post facto. The law requires that once regulations are made, they need to be placed in Parliament. And the mandate is Parliament and its committee, the Committee on Subordinate Legislation, is required to review these regulations. The sad but perhaps expected finding here is the level of parliamentary scrutiny over regulations and regulators is truly disappointing. Over a 24-year period, 99 to 2023, the Lok Sabha Parliamentary Committee has reviewed 13 regulations issued by all statutory regulatory authorities, and the Rajya Sabha Committee has reviewed 4. And I mentioned one regulator alone had made 650 regulations. So we have now more than 22 of these authorities at the union level. Clearly, only a very negligible number of regulations are getting scrutinized by the Indian Parliament. Clearly, therefore, there is a democratic deficit in regulation making, where writing law has gone away from the hands of elected representatives into the hands of unelected officials without the scrutiny that this process requires. But there is another perverse development which we need to worry about. Even with this minimal scrutiny, the increasing practice of regulation by these regulators through instruments other than regulation. Now, I mentioned a regulation made by the SRA needs to be placed in Parliament. So what does a regulator do? The regulator issues a circular. The regulator issues directions. Now, SEBI, you will recall, some years ago or maybe 1 year ago, decided to impose restrictions on mutual funds in the wake of what the SEBI had termed as insider trading type issues in a mutual fund. It issued a series of circulars, all of which are binding, and it didn't go through any of the process of making regulation. So not only did it not go through the process of making regulation, it does not get scrutinized by Parliament, even if the Parliament were to choose to do this. So binding obligations created by regulators without even following the minimal procedure that the law has established. There are many examples, but I think the point is made. Let me move to autonomy. Operational autonomy in the regulating domain is the other major reason for creating an SRA. Some laws do not confer on the regulator the autonomy to do this. For example, the Food Safety Standards Authority of India or the Airport Economic Regulatory Authority of India needs approval of the Government of India for their regulations. Most other SRA legislations now empower the regulator to make regulations without government approval. In practice, this gets exercised reasonably well, in my opinion, with one important exception. That exception is entities that are owned by the Government of India. So whether it's relaxation of listing conditions for an LIC or regulation of PSU banks, from a consumer protection angle or a market integrity point of view, there is no prima facie case for different rules of the game for government entities. Yet, this has become a regular practice, but clearly, it's not the SRAs that need to be blamed for this. The fault clearly lies with governments, and governments need to be much more enlightened and approach this with the equanimity that this deserves. The domain regulatory authority autonomy that I spoke about, the ability to write regulations and be able to do so without government approval, obviously requires a modicum of human resource autonomy and financial resource autonomy. Because if the regulator doesn't have the kind of people that are required, the monies that are required to hire these kinds of people, put in place processes, this will not work. Now, most financial sector regulators have been conferred this autonomy. But interestingly, the more recent regulators, IBBI for instance, the Insolvency Bankruptcy Board of India, prior to that the Competition Commission of India, do not have the same degree of resource autonomy. So it almost looks like the initial wave, an enlightened government gave the autonomy and then decided that probably we've ceded too much, and in a sense they've we can see it rolling back. But I'm talking only about financial sector regulators. Many other sectors, the regulators have much less resource autonomy. But the other difficult side of this equation is where there is autonomy, there has begun an increasingly worrying trend of the empowered regulators indulging in practices that would tantamount to abuse of autonomy if these were private entities. As an example, financial sector regulators have begun to amass vast resources using fees which constitutionally are meant to be for services rendered. Effectively, fees have become taxes with no relation to services rendered, and the kind of resource pools that are getting built up are large. The conclusion, therefore, on autonomy is somewhat mixed. We need to put in place a mechanism for autonomy in SRAs that do not have this operational freedom. In parallel, there needs to be safeguards, checks and balances to make sure that this autonomy is not used by SRA for purposes other than what was intended. Last of the four themes, accountability. All public agencies have to be accountable for their operations and outcomes to the people. This is standard principle of constitutional democracies. Depending on whether it's the American style system or the UK system, it is either through a minister or direct, but accountability mechanisms are essentially a standard part of all of our democracies. The primary accountability that is designed in most Indian SRAs is a requirement to place an annual report on the functioning of the regulator in Parliament. The idea being enable the Parliament to discuss the report and the activities of the SRA during the year and provide post facto guidance, directions, etc., etc. Now, I have researched this quite a bit, and to the best of my knowledge, this sort of a discussion has not happened even once in Indian Parliament for any SRA. This clearly takes us to a much larger problem of the working of Indian Parliament, but clearly beyond the scope of this talk. Sooner or later, we will need to find a solution to this larger problem. In the meanwhile, I think clearly there are things that we can do. Better designed reports put out in the public domain will at least enable interested members of academia, think tank, societies like ours, and interested citizens to analyze and critique the functioning of SRAs based on accessible and intelligible data and developments in the annual reports. Surprisingly, an important SRA, the SRA that I mentioned just 15 minutes ago, the RBI does not have a statutory requirement to place an annual report before the Parliament. Efforts at getting the RBI to do this have met with severe resistance, very well documented in a recent paper by Bhargavi Zaveri. The complete running history of this debate between government, Parliament and the RBI. And clearly, this is something which needs to be addressed by appropriate legislative changes. Annual reports are usually, a part of the annual report is an audited financial statement of the agency. In these agencies, it's not a big issue, but it's part of standard health and hygiene that you have audited financial statements of all agencies as part of their annual reports. And for public bodies, financial audit is done by a constitutionally mandated agency, an agency created by the Constitution called the Comptroller and Auditor General of India. The SEBI, the IRDA, the FSSAI, their annual reports and their annual financial statements actually are audited by the CAG. Now, continuing with my criticism of the RBI. Can you guess who audits the RBI's annual financial statement? For the year ending 2023, this was carried out by Messrs. Chanda Bhoy and Jasu Bhoy and Messrs. Ford Rhodes Parks and Company, two statutory auditors of the RBI. The RBI is a public agency which is not audited by the Supreme Auditor of India. As regards operational and transactional accountability, like appeals before an expert tribunal on the orders of a regulator, the Securities Appellate Tribunal that hears appeals against orders of SEBI has proved to be among the better administrative tribunals in the country. It has a long history. It wasn't part of the original SEBI Act. It got created. It became a multi-member body. A long history. But non-appointment of members in SAT for a long time, inadequate staffing, inadequate resources are some relatively easy to handle issues which can clearly improve accountability. As in the case of annual reports and audits, there is no appellate body which has jurisdiction over regulatory orders of the RBI. Just as appeals against IRDA and PFRDA are brought under the jurisdiction of SAT, it is, I think, a ready next step in the Indian financial regulatory system that appeals against the RBI come before the SAT, and the SAT ends up becoming what Justice had recommended, a financial services appellate tribunal. Let me now come to the last part of my lecture. I will conclude this part with a quotation from Shri B.G. Deshmukh. Many years ago, he wrote a piece that is called Some Perspectives on Governance for Development. This was exactly 20 years ago in the Indian Journal of Public Administration, January-March 2004 volume. He uses different words, phrases of those times, but I think captures the essence of what I have taken nearly 40 plus minutes to say. And he says, I quote, "It's a well-accepted view today that government must play the role of a facilitator and not as much as that of a doer. Having said that, it is imperative to build certain distinct capacities and skills that would make government departments respond to the new demand. One such capacity is the one which trains institutions and its people to provide quote-unquote assurance. No matter who produces the goods and services, whether under private or non-governmental sectors, what is needed is the concept and procedure to deliver assurance rather than outdated modes of control. Government continues to play the role of a custodian of social justice, but through a new mechanism of assuring its people that systems, processes, and trained people are positioned in a credible and responsible design to deliver predefined outcomes. Building on traditional ideas of quote-unquote accountability and quote-unquote auditability, the assurance approach is a paradigm shift in creating a high degree of maturity in processes and systems to enhance institutional response. I'm also very happy to be here doing this talk in the presence of Justice Sri Krishna. The most important and sophisticated thinking on this field was done in, Madam mentioned this, the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, which he chaired from 2011 to 13. It's great that he's here and so many members of his team. Now, I can't resist a story with the judge's permission. Among the last things that I did when I was in the Ministry of Finance was to get approval of the then Finance Minister, Shri Pranab Mukherjee, to agree to the idea of a Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission and announce it in the 2010 budget speech. Immediately after the announcement, in some official meeting, I happened to meet the former Finance Minister, Mr. P. Chidambaram, who was fully aware of these developments because these were being discussed for the last 3-4 years. The announcement happened during the tenure of Mr. Mukherjee, but Mr. Chidambaram was fully familiar with this. So he took some of us aside and said, great, complimented us on seeing the idea through in the form of a budget announcement, and asked if I had thought of who is going to be able to do this, what he said is a seemingly impossible task. I said, I have thought through that, sir, and I mentioned the name of Justice Sri Krishnan. He said nothing, and our meeting ended, and I sort of quietly went back to work. Exactly 2 days later, the cabinet took a decision to bifurcate the state of Andhra Pradesh into 2 states and created a committee under a retired judge to carry out and work out all the details. And guess who the judge was? Justice Sri Krishna. And I'm sort of still reeling under the sort of assault of this from the newspapers, and I get an SMS from Mr. Chidambaram, and it says, I stole your judge. We weren't going to give up. So we went back. We took the approval of Mr. Pranab Mukherjee then itself. He waited for 10 full months. I left the Ministry of Finance. The announcement came in 2011, but we got an FSLRC that was headed by Justice Sri Krishna, and I wrote back to Mr. Chidambaram, we stole him back. And I'm glad we did that, sir. Most of the important ideas on reform process, at least in the last 10 years or so, have been caused or nudged through the FSLRC report and the draft law. The merger of FMC into SEBI, the Forward Markets Commission merging into SEBI, the placement of appeals against IRDA and PFRDA into SAT, the first role clarity for RBI. If you recall, it is the original act says a temporary measure, 1934 Act, and conferring or mandating an inflation target and a monetary policy committee, which came in 2015-16. I can go on. All of these, in some form or the other, emanated from FSLRC. Though the context was the financial sector, the 140 odd sections in the FSLRC draft law actually apply to all regulators and not just financial regulators. The way forward then is to pull these sections together, maybe do a quick fresh review, and create an overarching general statutory regulatory authority framework which is domain agnostic. And there is a clear analogy here with the Administrative Procedures Act 1946 of the United States. Most policies and initiatives are born in hope and optimism. Many times there are elements of the state which exhibit what a scholar, Lant Pritchett, calls isomorphic mimicry, where we build things that outwardly resemble the successful institutions seen in the more advanced, more evolved societies, but good intentions, high hopes, optimism, and isomorphic mimicry do not add up to success. Many years down, there is often decline and sadness and disappointment. And then our task is not to accept this low-level equilibrium. Our task is to rise above the despondence. Our task lies in improving the first principles understanding, in bringing out the heavy artillery of knowledge of political science, public administration, constitution, and economics, through which we can go deeper and find solutions. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this opportunity and a very patient hearing.